Okay, I'm here today with my friend Satya, and we're going to talk about her recent work on the quarter life. I'm really excited to have you here today so we can talk about this.
I'm really honored and excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sure. I haven't done interviews in a while, but I'm excited to kind of kick off a few more with you and bring in this Jungian lens and talk about where we're at with developmental Jungian psychology and something that's not usually talked about often, which is the quarter life. We're usually very focused on midlife in Jungian psychology, and I think now more and more people are getting interested in Jungian work. I've experienced that. I don't know, it sounds like you have too. Before we get started, I'm just going to go ahead and uh, introduce you to those who are listening. Satya Doyle Byock is a psychotherapist and the author of Quarterlife, The Search of the Self in Early Adulthood. And we're going to talk about this a little bit today, but we're also going to have a conversation about Jungian stuff that comes out in the book. It's published on Random House. It came out in July. Her writing is driven by a desire to influence how developmental psychology attends to the first 20 years of adulthood, incorporating a social justice lens as well as a search towards meaning in the first half of adulthood, not just stability, which is important. We'll get a little bit more into that. Her clinical work, writing, and teaching are rooted in Jungian psychology, activism, trauma-informed care, and historical research. Satya teaches online at the Salome Institute, which she founded and directs. And you can find her at satyabyock.com or salomeinstitute.com. And I'm going to put her for her Instagram down below so you guys can find it. So to get started, I'm excited to have a chat about Jungian stuff and kind of see where it goes as we usually do. But first, just tell me, I'm like selfishly interested in how you got where you're at and like why you study what you study.
Yes, well, I mean, I'm excited to have that conversation with you too. I think we probably have some similar backgrounds, though I don't know fully yet. I was a 10-year-old searching for meaning, reading Buddhist texts and Hindu texts and trying to understand the world, and 14 years old having some crises, existential crises. Certainly in college, and so when college was over and the sort of roadmap of my life had come to a close, as far as anyone had really clearly laid it out for me, I was completely despairing, just very confused, depressed, and anxious. And one of these conversations I was having with my mother, who was a therapist growing up. She was a therapist in her career, and also I kind of later understood also an astrologer and a Jungian psychotherapist, which is not something I'd had any knowledge of before, and she sent me off to college with a copy of the I Ching, divination system, so there were these things that I had sort of had little bits and pieces of in my consciousness, but had not fully understood. And so when I think it was 23, I'm forgetting exactly now, but kind of having one of these major moments of crisis, my mother sent me Thomas More's Care of the Soul, which I completely devoured and just suddenly felt like, wait, what did I just read? That's all I knew to articulate to her. Like, what was this thing that I just experienced? And she told me, well, it's based on Carl Jung's psychology. You might want to read Jung's memoir. So I immediately went to the bookstore, picked up a copy of Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, and just devoured it. And boom, my life changed. And this is what I wanted to do. I started dream groups and I had a Jungian analyst. And at one point in another moment of crisis, she sort of suggested to me, you really might benefit from like going to graduate school and getting some time to study and just pause. She said, what would you want to study, like in theory? And I said, the only thing I'm interested in studying is Jungian psychology. That's it. That's the only thing I can even conceive of wanting to study, And she said, well, there's this school you could go to, So that's how I ended up at Pacifica Graduate Institute in California. And and the rest is history, as they say. I became really obsessed though with trying to understand why in the Jungian space there was no conversation being had around the time of life that I was in, which was my early to mid 20s at the time. So, that brings us to this conversation, but I won't get ahead of myself.
I love that. I just love that you've written this book and written it in the way that you did. It's very digestible and it's very palpable for those that are in this process or probably at this stage of their life. And a lot of my clients also, I think, would really relate to it, and myself too. I mean, I relate to your story in such a big way and how I got into this work and eventually became a Jungian psychotherapist myself. I like total life change and really wanting only to study that as well, as people can see. But I I had a career change myself and had to go back to school and was really in that space because kind of really in a huge descent that Jung has theorized doesn't happen until midlife. So we know now that that's not true, and a lot of people there trying to find things to help them through that. So one
Yeah.
of the really interesting concepts in the book that I like what you were doing with language was moving towards meaning and stability and what that feels like and how we can encounter those at this stage, um, in either one of those typologies. So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about what that was for you in creating that dichotomy and what that helps you do in your work.
Well, I'm excited to talk with you about it and to talk in this space about it because I get to kind of get into some of the background of what these terms are that's harder to talk about with the general public that aren't familiar necessarily with Jung's work. Jung's work we know was pretty gendered historically, and I talk at the Salome Institute about kind of reading Jung's work with what I call an 80-20 lens, which is 80% I still find to be sort of mind-blowing, ahead of its time, super helpful and informative. 20% is either egregiously wrong, or off base, or just really needs kind of revision. And some of the gender stuff, I think we all know, needs some revision. But he was doing something. I mean, it changed throughout his work depending on, the books or the essays that he was writing at the time over the 50 years or so that he was writing. But he often correlated, we know, the unconscious with the feminine and the conscious mind with the masculine, right? And it got complicated depending on who he was talking about. But he talked about the relationship between the ego and the self, the unconscious, the sort of soul self. We can use different language for that. And so in my book, I wanted to talk about these ideas of the relationship between what we might call the masculine and the feminine, or what we might call the ego and the self or the unconscious. But I needed to find ways to do that for everybody, right? And so over a lot of editing and conversations with my editor and writing, what came forward was the need to have the structure and the stability that ego provides and the conscious mind the ego provides, and to have the ability to be in kind of the everything, we might call it the more Piscean space, or the more, the very deep unconscious soulful, maybe the feminine space. So I talk about it in the book a little alchemically. I talk about it as needing both the goblet and the wine, or the surfboard and the ocean, that we need both elements. We need both the ego and the self. So in the book, I talk about those really more specifically as the stability and meaning, and that some people in quarter life are really entering their own independent lives from one side or the other, more typically, that there are people who are really more comfortable with stability and structure and kind of social norms, and there's people who are really more comfortable with the opposite, with being in the ocean, with being in the inner life, the unconscious, whatever. So trying to find language for that is digestible for everyone.
Yeah, and the case examples that you were giving, I could see, how just from a Jungian model or a framework of working analytically, that you can find a way to balance those two, or like that is part of the goal, is to find, like, if someone is more in their meaning and seeking of meaning, and helping them stabilize that and kind of ground that in their meaning making, versus those who are
Yeah,
more structured seeking and stability seeking, and helping them enrich their life and deepen what that
absolutely.
stability is.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so the model that Jung created and that has really been, I think of it as it's being perpetuated kind of as a dogma over time in the Jungian
Yeah.
world. There's various dogmas in the Jungian world, and one of them is this second half of life dogma that I
Mhm.
think I at this point really just kind of roll my eyes around it because it is repeated so constantly and so without question. Meanwhile, Jungian communities are desperate for younger people and they don't know why younger people don't come to their lectures and whatnot. It's like, first of all, everyone who's lecturing is, often over 65. I mean, it's an aging population of academics and analysts. But the other thing is that there's a very frequent one heteronormative, that's like a whole nother thing, but second half of life obsession. And the reason for that is because Jung really speaks in his work about the critical importance of having a healthy ego before you engage with the inner life, with self. That's in my languaging, it's essentially you need to be a stability person before you search for meaning. You need to have this capacity to be in the external world before you engage with the inner world. But the problem is that society has changed quite significantly since Jung's time. I mean, I don't know that it was entirely true even in his time, but with gender roles completely transformed and society so transformed, what we have are a lot of people coming in who are not comfortable engaging with society or the external world or structures and stability. And so, well, what do? I mean, you can't just say, well, this isn't going to work for you. And I mean, I've read things in the Jungian world that essentially say that, but like that doesn't help us as clinicians. And it doesn't help our clients who are, what I call meaning types, kind of more in the unconscious soup to find their way. Right. So I really did try to approach it from both sides to say, how do you find the opposite? How do you find your balance?
Right, and that ego development is so important in order to even turn inward and really
Yeah.
handle what the real meanings that come out might be. And at the same time, the stability typology, really also needing to work to break down what those old structures are.
Yeah.
And it's that question of the ego, and how do we hold that, and how do we also individuate at the same time.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, like when you're working with your clients, and especially those, working through this passage, how does individuation show up in a way that, feels different, or feels like it's shifting? I mean, because with my clients, I sense it, it's wanting to start, it's wanting to happen in a way that we've previously thought like we've had to wait.
Yeah. Right. Well, that's, I think, the first starting point is we don't buy into the belief that individuation has to wait. I just don't know why that would. I mean, I talk about this a lot in various pieces of writing, but it's like it just doesn't make sense that the transformation of consciousness be tied to biological age and a modern Western lifespan, and it just doesn't make sense. So the reality, as I see it, is that people can be kind of longing for this at kind of any point. They might be drawn to wholeness, to their truest self, to balance, and know something's not quite right, this dawning of consciousness. So it's our job, again, as clinicians or people who kind of have been through this, to support that in some way, right? But I also think, and this is a modification of Jung's work again, but it's understanding that if somebody's really stuck kind of in the unconscious, I mean, he talks about this he started his work with schizophrenic patients, right? So his earliest work, and this continued through his career, was really supporting people to do this kind of ego development out of the swimming psyche, the inner world, people who really were, whose egos were kind of swallowed up by the unconscious. And to my mind, that's individuation. right? It's not the same story as the midlife crisis, as a businessman who is no longer satisfied and wants to leave his wife and run off. And those stories are in Jung's works, of course, as well. But it started with trying to support people to find wholeness that were lost in the unconscious, and I think we write those stories off too much. Like, those people Jung was just supporting to get balanced and heal. Other people he was supporting to individuate. I'm not sure that's the right story.
Right. And I think even on a collective level, there's a longing for more meaning, or, starting the individuation process. I don't know if they don't really know or call it that, but we definitely see it out there, especially
Yeah.
in social media and out on the internet now, that these things are moving and churning, and questions are being asked about the structure of our society, and if they should really go that prescribed way still, and
Yeah.
how, if they don't want to, do they find their way? And in the book, you really kind of lay out a little bit of a map of like how they can consider that and build that for themselves. So I really loved that, and it kind of resonated with a lot of the things that I feel like just intuitively come up from my clients in the work that I do with them. So like first, like listening to the self, like how does somebody even do that? And I mean, brings up so many questions, social justice questions of like, how can, who can, when can they?
Mm.
Um, but just kind of from your perspective and from the book, like talk a little bit about that. Like how do we listen to the self at this age?
Yeah. So, again, I come back a little bit to the masculine and feminine, the yin and the yang. And for me, my language in the book is I talk about 4 pillars of growth. And the second pillar, although I don't think of them chronologically, but in the book, the second pillar is to listen, which is kind of more of the yin energy. And that it's really the opposite of what society is generally telling people in quarter life, in what Jung called the first half of life, to do. And Jung doesn't talk about it this way. It's like, again, midlifers should really be attending to their inner life. People in the first half of life need to be very extroverted, very engaged in the masculine, etc. So what I speak about is that, we have to tend to our wounds. We have to do healing work. I mean, it's so important to work on healing work in whatever form you can find it. Maybe it's just reading a book. Maybe it's seeing a therapist. Maybe it's working in body work, or finding your right healers to support integration in a new way. But so many people in this time of life are suffering, right? And so rather than just pushing through kind of and pretending as if and making things work externally, I really just encourage whoever you are, to practice listening to yourself, to practice knowing who you are, and to not interpret that as narcissism, which it's not, or self-obsession, which it's not. It's actually working on building a relationship with yourself. And to do that, we need to listen. We need to pay attention, right? So in various ways, I talk about the importance of listening to oneself.
Right. And it's so important in so many deeper ways, and Jung talked about that differentiation between, like you were saying, navel gazing and actually going inward and meeting
Yeah.
what that self really is. And so many different spaces and fields we can define the self a certain way, but Jung spoke about it in a very specific way, and it really is an experience. And to really go and meet that part of ourselves, as we're doing our kind of ego development, I think is really critical to integrate and not wait.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the conundrum that the Quarterlifers get into, because the self is so critical to the individuation process, and making those decisions that align with us uh, in a particular way that feel liberating, are also in connection to soul, but also in terms of just kind of going out there into the world. Our individuation, meeting with the self is not like a narcissistic thing, just the way you're talking
Well,
about it. Like
in fact,
we have
it's
to do it.
arguably, yeah, it's arguably the opposite. I mean,
Hmm.
that's to truly have a sense of wholeness and completion, and to know oneself deeply, is really the opposite of the emptiness of narcissism. And I think in common language, we interpret narcissism very differently than it actually is. A narcissist has no real sense of self. And if we want to withdraw our projections, which was a huge component of Jung's understanding of actually how to change the world, is to withdraw projections, deal with your own shadow, engage with your own anima and animus, your masculine and feminine, and do this work of alchemy and the inner marriage within one's existence and in one's closest relationships with deep communication. That's transformative. That ripples out. That's transformative for the whole world. It's the opposite of narcissism. And we need to know that and understand that so we can be freed up to say, oh yeah, I do want to search for wholeness within myself.
Right. And it's also in service of the community and the collective to tend to our individuation, which is, us as individuals, but ultimately the goal to come outward.
Yeah.
In order to show up integrally outwardly, we have to go inward. And I think that's something that many of my Quarterlifers are learning and, trying to prioritize versus some of the status quo goals of the outward life. And I think
Yes.
even if they're stability types and meaning types, I mean, they're all there and struggling with the way the system is working, and in terms of, just taking themselves up and finding what they love, right? One of the things you also talk about is like tending to the things that we love and like, and trying to foster, actively our interest in those things. And
Yeah.
that's I loved to hear that, because it's like something that stands out to me in my work with my clients is I try to get them to love what they love. People show up and they love things and they know they love things, but they don't actively love them.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a conjunctio in and of itself to learn to do that.
Yeah. Totally.
And another aspect of, what you were talking about is building. So like that's a big part of quarter life. Like tell us a little bit about that stage of the work for you.
Yeah. So to build, this is my language around the sort of yang element, but it's more of the extroverted, more of the willpower, more of the determination. So in some ways I talk about this in the book, but I think of the 80s Karate Kid, or maybe even the Jaden Smith Karate Kid, but it's like, it's the wax on, wax off, where there's a mentee and a mentor, a wise mentor. The wise mentor is telling him, basically, you got to trust me that you're going to wax my car, and do these movements over and over and over again. And at some point, it's going to coalesce into something deeper for you. Right. And in no way am I suggesting that everyone find like a strict master and, in any case, but there's a quality of needing to develop that inside of ourselves. Astrologically, it's kind of Saturnian, or mythologically, there's this energy of ideally kind of a wise, one could call it the masculine or the father, but it's this energy of repetition and determination and strength, and needing to push through boredom and irritation and laziness and immaturity. There's a deep maturation that happens when we can kind of consistently engage with something. Maybe it's just our own healing of not giving up. Maybe it's a writing practice. Maybe it's a painting practice. Maybe it's practicing communication, even if you get shot down over and over. There's a quality of kind of stepping into your own maturation. And so in a lot of different ways, I think of that. I call that in the book to build, and also really honor that the etymology of the word to build is also to be. It's rooted in how we create ourselves, how we become ourselves. And that takes work, it takes real effort.
Yeah, it's bringing to mind something that I often turn to in Jung, which is like the self is our greatest art project.
Yeah.
And kind of developing that is in its own way, a part of the larger kind of finding our way in the world. We're always so fixated on like, what's my career going to be? What's my purpose? Some of these things that can be really distracting and still mired in our kind of collective constructs. So
Yeah.
like really focusing on these two aspects, but having it be a deeper process and connecting with the self, to build ourselves, but also to build what is of meaning to us out in the world. And sometimes I love how you mentioned multiple times in the book that it's not just going to happen. It's not
Yeah.
gonna just like jump out at us and tell us what we're supposed to do. And there's so many people out there that kind of long for that. But it really does take that inner Senex to say, actually, we have to make this decision.
Right.
We have to decide what this is going to be, and we have to go after it.
Yeah, and it means kind of developing a new culture inside of ourselves, because the external culture is really, there isn't any Senex energy. I mean, we know that, right? Like it's very much about quick conclusions, quick fixes, immediate success, and not the transformative work of the alchemical process, of the labor, and it's hard. I mean, a huge part of what I wanted to do in this book is to just create a new story for people in this time of life, that it does take time, that it is more about the magnum opus of one's own self, the beautiful art project of one's own self, and not just about this vertical ladder that was certainly how, I mean, I was raised in a certain respect with some depth psychology around me in retrospect, but the larger culture is just about acquisition and climbing. And ultimately, that's so painful and empty of soul for us. We need a new story.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it, speaking to like that initiatory lack out in
Yeah.
this type of society that we're in, that it doesn't teach us these things. It teaches very basic kind of how to survive, but in ways that benefit the capitalistic society, and they don't touch on these deeper aspects of the individual and how they can build their life in a way that's driven by soul or related to soul. uh, I think that, um, in terms of also like being in therapy, right? Like what it kind of gives therapy a whole new role that we don't really talk about a lot, which is interesting when you bring up the mentorship. That for those in their quarter life, it really does give them an opportunity to have a type of relationship that they wouldn't find out in the world,
No,
and
totally.
to kind of contain that, in a safe way enough for them to explore these things. That's what I write my dissertation on in terms of the crone and the puella. We talk so much about
Oh,
the puer and the senex, right? But
yeah,
to have it,
beautiful.
for the feminine too, and all her complexity. But when you think about, like, I'm going to give you a tough question. So like, if I
Bring
was
it.
a client and I was showing up and I said, well, I just didn't have the resources that I need. I don't have my basic needs met. I'm really struggling and out on my own. How do I go about this work? It seems like I can't afford that. I can't afford therapy. So from this lens, like, how do you work with that?
Well, it's a huge question. It's a great question. I talk in the conclusion about essentially all the clients I cannot see, not only because I, as a therapist, as any therapist, is extremely limited in my capacity to serve a population that's really important to me. And that, I mean, whether it's burnout or literal just time and days of the week, we can only see so many people. So that's first. I mean, I think there's a real healthcare shortage. I know there's a healthcare shortage. There's a therapist shortage. And there's wait lists everywhere. So that's just full stop an issue, right? But then, and again, I speak about this at length in the conclusion. There's all the clients I cannot see because I can't do 100% sliding scale. I've always done some sliding scale, right? I can't stay on every insurance panel. And insurance is a racket. It's a totally messed up, confusing world, and therapists get kind of the last pay of the day from insurance companies. It's a very complicated system for mental health and for all of healthcare. So the first thing is, I, for the most part, typically agree with these clients. It's really tricky. It's extremely complicated financially, how to get good therapy. And even if you can pay, it can be really complicated. How do you get good, solid therapy that is filled with integrity and soul and boundaries and good container and all those things? It's hard to find. So there's a lot that I wish we could be doing on a social justice level of supporting this time of life to be, you know, really kind of an anchor for our democracy to say, hey, rather than saddling you with student debt and credit card debt and selling you cigarettes and AK-47s and getting the cops involved at every indiscretion or every problem, what if we were to give you some money as soon as you're out on your own and you had a basic monthly income, you had a living wage, you had healthcare. Maybe there's retreat centers when you're really falling apart. There's places you can go to heal and do soul work. There are things that in actuality wouldn't cost that much money that I think could be transformative for our society. So it's hard to answer that really excellent question you asked one-on-one as a therapist to a client, because you're dealing with two individuals in a completely broken system. So what I'm trying to offer, in addition to kind of this one-to-one clinical work and this larger Jungian framework for therapy for this time of life, is also like, structurally, we are doing a terrible job of bringing people into adulthood and welcoming people into society as independent individuals. And there's 1,000 things we could be doing to make that easier.
Yeah, and really, I think in many ways, working on just like helping individuals turn inward, but like
Yeah.
giving them tools. And I think people out there like yourself, I'm sure with the Salome Institute, like providing classes and in like just in an initiatory way, helping them feel through these problems existentially, but spiritually and psychically, and how to set up an internal praxis with themselves. So like how to
Yeah.
do inner work on your own. It's absolutely possible. It's helpful if you have trauma to be with a therapist and to work with your dreams and the unconscious. But when you're a quarter lifer and you are eating beans out of a can in college, like there
Yeah.
are definitely ways to step out. And just like you said, like you joined dream groups, there were
Yeah.
things that were there for you. At the same time, out it's like the wild west out there on the internet. Everybody
Totally. Well, that's
how I feel about that. And it's kind of dangerous. And discernment is such a huge key to that. Being able to discern.
discernment is the golden word, and because of course there's a lot of predators in so many in every field, but I mean there's a lot of cult leaders, there's a lot of religious hacks, there's a lot of terrible therapists. And on some level, I think quarter life is also about building the discernment. I mean, a huge level, it's building the discernment, which really requires us to trip and fall and to fall into the wrong hands sometimes. I mean, I certainly did. I don't wish it on anyone. Nobody does. But we also, I hopefully, again, if we can see it psychologically, we try to go, oh, whoa, this is what I'm learning from this about myself and about other people. This is how I'm building boundaries, withdrawing projections, all that work, right? But you're absolutely right. I mean, I have fear. It's like I both want all this stuff to be as democratized as possible and like, wait, what's your background? What's your training? What are you really saying here? All that stuff gets scary.
Yeah, it's really tough. And when I notice, people in quarter life who are in, this place trying to figure this out, trying to go on their own descent, and then they go out there on the internet, self
Yeah.
is trying to emerge. It's an emergency.
Yeah.
And so they kind of glob onto things, and there's tons of people out there misusing this language, especially the old language, and not knowing the shadow of it. So when you use the language that you use in this book for them, it's just so refreshing. And there's, I can sense a deep care there, and my own process too, kind of wrestling with it in the beginning and really understanding it now. But to focus on what's important first. That's
Yeah.
a part of the ego development too in the book. It's like, well, let's focus on really what's happening in the psyche. Let's not get wrapped up in all these archetypes and things that really don't matter.
Totally. Totally. The Jungian jargon, like any jargon, it can be so distracting and so kind of intoxicating. And then of course, I mean, there's a lot of people misusing the language or using it in ways that I don't identify with. Let's put it that way. that don't resonate with me,
Right.
yeah.
Not the professional way that we use that language.
Yeah, yeah.
It's very triggering. So, I mean, at the end here, I'm curious, if you kind of know probably my audience a little bit. A lot of people in their quarter life, kind of getting interested, but like serious about it in the ways that we probably were when we were younger.
Yeah.
What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, I'm excited by your community. Like I'm excited that there are so many people who are rigorously interested in this, or because you have a very academic,
Don't tell
okay,
me
I won't,
that.
sorry, I won't, what do I say? So what do I tell your, gosh, I don't know. I'm excited you're here to, everyone. Like it really is fun. There's a playground quality to like, oh yeah, let's really get into these ideas and apply them to ourselves and apply them to the world and take them off the dusty shelves, or take them out of the kind of super heteronormative, second half of life. There's or inaccessible language around it. Like it's fun for me to be playing with these ideas. And at the Solomon Institute, I talk about kind of bringing Jung's work into social relevance. Jung in the Red Book talks a lot about the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths, right? And that's really where I'm excited to be living with this work, is to really honor this moment in time, as insane as it is. How do we honor this moment in time in relation to this depth work, which is really what Jung was doing at World War I, World War II. I mean, some of the worst moments in history globally, right? That's where this work came from. So I'm excited to be in relationship with you and your community around this stuff, because I think it's so vibrant and really has the potential to change lives and save lives and make an impact on this world that seems like it's falling apart at the seams sometimes.
Yes, yes, I can't agree more. I mean, I just get so excited about it, and I think aspects of this work and talking about it in this way, and this really, like on the frontier of where Jungian work is really going, because it's still advocating for those big things that we're all advocating for, and finding a way to continue to integrate that
Yeah.
and make that possible is so important. And really, it's very academic for me, but it's also very mostly about soul and
Yeah.
mostly about anima mundi, and really digging into what that is in the unconscious, because no matter what the times are, we still have that deep goal, and soul is calling and wanting to be realized through that process
Yeah.
and advocated for. And that's all the things that we're coming to consciousness right now. So, and I think that alongside quarter life, I feel for individuals in their quarter life right now, because of that.
Totally.
It's a hard
Oh,
time.
totally. Totally. I mean, I know we're wrapping up here, but it brings up for me, my quarter life was, I mean, I was already in crisis, and then 9/11 happened, I was in my dorm room watching the television. I was just telling the story to my nephew, who was asking, he was, learning about it in class, and he asked me what was my experience with 9/11. I was just starting my sophomore year of college, and then we started to massive wars that I protested vigorously and went on for 20 years or whatever, right? So it's like we're in this extreme chaos and pain, and we know how much that intersects with us in the first half of life, in adulthood, as we're trying to figure out who we are. How do we emerge into ourselves when the world feels like it's in extreme chaos? So that's just a conversation that it just feels so important for us to be having on a more soulful level, and to kind of reimagine this field in the process. Let's reimagine how this work can be useful to us now and valuable to the world now.
Absolutely. I mean, and all the things that are in the unconscious, especially thinking about how we kind of make our way, but also deal with these issues. Like Hillman says, it's the world that's wounded. It's not
Yeah.
something that's wrong with us, and
Yeah.
especially those who are marginalized, and aspects of their struggle in quarter life that are that are untended to and lost in soul and in the unconscious. It's like that's what she really rise. I mean, I think COVID was totally anima mundi, just like
Yeah.
telling us to stop, right? Just to go go home.
Go home.
But
Yeah.
that's me
Yeah.
and my meaning typology.
Yeah.
But I'm just going to show your book here one more time and give people a chance to go and get it. And thank you so much for giving me your time and giving those listening your time. And I think it's going to be just invaluable. And hopefully we do some more stuff together down the road.
I would love that. Really, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. I'm grateful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.